Two men climbed into a Cessna 170 on a clear Oklahoma morning. Neither one had a pilot's license. Minutes later, both were dead. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some freak mechanical failure. The airplane itself was fine. What killed them was a tangled mess of reckless decisions. Flying drunk, flying unlicensed, flying an airplane that wasn't even legally registered. Was this just bad luck, or was tragedy practically guaranteed the moment those wheels left the ground? Let's break it down. The GPS record shows the airplane made more than one attempt at flying that morning. First, they did a short hop out and back, then another circuit with what looked like a touch and go. Finally, they came back in for what should have been a simple landing. But that's when everything unraveled. According to the witness, after lifting off the turf runway, the plane started to porpoise. That's when the nose bobs up and down in an unstable rhythm. And here's where it gets really crazy. In a tailwheel airplane like the Cessna 170, porpoising is not just a little bump. It's a pilot-induced oscillation, or PIO, and if you don't correct it instantly, it just gets worse. The airplane essentially fights you. One wrong control input, and you've set up a deadly chain reaction. Now, the witness also said something important. The engine sounded fine. That rules out what a lot of casual observers love to assume, an engine failure. The power plant was working, the prop was turning, but the airplane was being mishandled. And that's the real story here. The defining event was loss of control, pure and simple. Here's where things get both fascinating and deeply frustrating. In the right seat was the airplane's owner, 30-year-old David Rondell Dodd Jr. He had bought the airplane back in 2015, but the FAA had denied him a medical certificate after neuropsychological testing revealed cognitive impairments. In other words, the system had already told him, "You're not safe to fly." But instead of respecting that, he kept the airplane and on this day climbed into it heavily intoxicated. Toxicology showed an astronomical blood alcohol concentration, around 38 to 43 grams per deciliter, nearly 10 times what the FAA allows. On top of that, he had multiple central nervous system depressants in his system, from barbiturates to antidepressants. In the left seat was 54-year-old James Wade Bruce, a friend of the owner. He also had no pilot certificate, and his toxicology wasn't much better. A blood alcohol level over the FAA limit, plus Xanax and citalopram. So here's the million-dollar question. Who was actually flying? The NTSB couldn't say. Both men had control injuries on their arms and wrists, suggesting they each may have had hands on the yoke. But in some sense, it doesn't even matter. Neither man was legally or physically fit to be at the controls of that airplane. And when no one in the cockpit is qualified, the outcome isn't just unpredictable, it's practically predetermined. Now let's talk about the machine they were flying. The Cessna 170B is a classic taildragger, built in 1952. It's beloved by vintage aircraft fans, and when flown correctly, it's a perfectly capable airplane. But it's not a trainer for beginners. Tailwheel airplanes demand precision. They're more prone to ground loops. They wander on takeoff, and they punish sloppy technique on landing. And here's where things get truly sketchy. This airplane's registration had lapsed back in 2021. Legally, it wasn't even airworthy. That doesn't mean the airplane was mechanically broken. Investigators found no pre-impact failures, but think about it. An unregistered airplane is a red flag. It tells you nobody's keeping up with paperwork, maybe not even maintenance. And, more importantly, it becomes a magnet for exactly the kind of flying we saw here. Off the record, under the radar, operated by people who shouldn't be flying at all. So, the airplane itself wasn't to blame, but the circumstances surrounding its ownership and condition, those were flashing warning lights that went ignored. On the surface, the weather that morning looked good. The skies were clear, visibility stretched a full 10 miles, a picture-perfect VFR day. But hidden in those numbers was a detail that experienced pilots notice immediately: the wind. 15 knots, gusting up to 22, coming straight out of the south. Now, a gusty crosswind might not sound dramatic to a non-pilot, but in a light tail dragger like the Cessna 170, it can be brutal. These airplanes have a mind of their own on takeoff and landing. The center of gravity sits behind the main wheels, which means once the tail starts to swing, it wants to keep swinging. In calm air, a skilled pilot can stay ahead of it with quick rudder corrections, but throw in a sudden gust at 20 knots, the airplane demands instant, precise reactions. And you can't be even a second late. And here's the detail that really makes you shake your head. Gage Airport has 2 runways, a full-length paved runway and a shorter turf strip. Which one were these guys using? The turf. That's a less forgiving surface, shorter distance, and more challenging in gusts. Why didn't they just use the paved runway sitting right there? Probably because they were out joyriding, not making conservative decisions. Think about it this way. Even a fully qualified current pilot might break a sweat trying to handle a vintage tail dragger in those conditions, on turf, at low altitude. So imagine doing it impaired, with no license, no training, and delayed reactions. That's not just risky, that's practically suicidal. But if you want the real explanation for why this crash happened, you've got to look inside the pilots' bodies, not the sky. The toxicology reports were jaw-dropping. The owner, sitting in the right seat, had a blood alcohol concentration somewhere between 38 and 43 grams per deciliter. For reference, the FAA says you're grounded at 4. He was almost 10 times that. At that level, most people can barely walk in a straight line, let alone coordinate a control yoke and rudder pedals. And the alcohol was only the start. He also had phenobarbital, doxepin, hydroxyzine, a full list of central nervous system depressants. Every one of those drugs slows you down, clouds your judgment, and when combined with alcohol, they amplify each other. The FAA's own database literally flags some of these as "do not fly under any circumstance." So medically, this guy was light years away from being safe in an airplane. Then there's the left seat occupant, James Bruce. His blood alcohol was lower, but still way over the limit. Between 11 and 16, that's enough to impair coordination and reaction time on its own. But add Xanax, which depresses the nervous system even more, plus an antidepressant, and you've got another person in no shape to handle a complex machine. And here's the kicker. Both men had injuries on their hands and arms consistent with holding the controls. So it's entirely possible they were both trying to fly. Picture that. 2 impaired people, no training, both with their hands on the yoke, in gusty conditions, at low altitude. It's not just dangerous, it's a nightmare scenario. And remember, FAA rules couldn't be clearer. No flying within 8 hours of drinking, no flying at BAC over 0.04. But these guys blew past that by miles, and they're not alone. The NTSB has found that roughly 28% of fatally injured pilots test positive for impairing substances. That's nearly 1 in 3. It's not some obscure problem, it's a systemic one. And this accident is basically the textbook definition of how bad it can get when all the red flags line up. So when investigators wrote the probable cause, they didn't mince words. Loss of control by non-certificated pilots with impairment and cognitive issues as contributing factors. It wasn't the airplane. It wasn't maintenance. It wasn't even just the gusty wind. It was human choices. Choices stacked one on top of another until there was no margin left. And here's where the bigger lesson comes in. A lot of people look at FAA regulations and think of them as hoops to jump through. Medical exams, licensing, alcohol restrictions. They feel like bureaucracy. But this crash proves why they exist. They aren't red tape. They're guardrails. They're the one thing keeping reckless flying from becoming routine. And let's be blunt. Crashes like this do more than take lives. They hurt the reputation of general aviation as a whole. Every time a story like this hits the news, drunk pilots, no license, unregistered airplane, it paints the entire community in a bad light. And that's extremely frustrating for thousands of responsible pilots who play by the rules and treat safety seriously. At the end of the day, This accident wasn't about bad luck. It was about reckless choices. Unlicensed flying, impaired judgment, ignoring medical disqualifications, picking the wrong runway in gusty winds, one after another. And when those choices stack up, tragedy isn't surprising. It's inevitable.